Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here at this Eurostat's webinar in honor of the International Women's Day. Today, we will be looking at women's presence in science, technology, and research. My name is Romina Grondino from Eurostat's Dissemination and User Support Unit, and I'll be the moderator today. We have a series of presentations on European statistics on women in science, technology and research, and also about the policy perspective. I will introduce our speakers as we get to that. I'd like to start briefly with some housekeeping. We have a questions and answer session at the end of this webinar. And for the questions, we would like to invite you to send your questions via Slido. There's a Slido code 6417299 and the QR. You can use the code and the QR to post your questions in Slido. They are visible right now on screen. I see some questions have already come in. Thank you for that. At the end of this webinar, we would like you to take a little moment and fill in a brief satisfaction survey, which we will also post on Slido. It's important for us to know what your thoughts were on this webinar and give us some feedback. This event is being recorded and it's our intention to put the recording up on Eurostat's website and Facebook page. So if you cannot stay for the entire webinar, you can always catch up afterwards. I think that's for housekeeping. As I said, we have a series of presentations today on statistics on women in science, technology and research and on the policy perspective. But before that, I'd like to start by inviting Sophie Limpa, Director of Business and Trade Statistics at Eurostat, who will give an introduction of this webinar. Over to you, Sophie.
Thanks a lot, Romina, and good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us this morning. I am Sophie Limpa, the Director in charge of Business and Trade Statistics in Eurostat, the statistical office of the European Union. I would like to welcome you to this new webinar organized by Eurostat today at the occasion of the upcoming International Women's Rights Day that will be celebrated in 2 days on 8th of March. As a woman, as an engineer, and as a person generally interested in science, I am particularly happy to introduce this webinar on women in science, technology and research. Eurostat already published a short news item on this topic at the occasion of the International Day of Women and Girls in Science in late February. However, we wanted to dive deeper in this fascinating topic, and so here we are with a fully fledged webinar allowing us to showcase our wealth of data on the participation of women in those fields that have been traditionally and for too long considered as domains reserved for men. Science and technology are part of almost every aspect of our daily life, and they can also help tackle some of the major challenges facing society. For instance, tackling environment or international security threats, ensuring safer food, developing new medicine to prevent or fight illnesses and disease, answering issues linked to an aging population, just to name a few examples. Science, technology and research are also considered as one of the main driving forces behind growth and job creation in the EU. This is why the European Union is strongly supporting scientific progress and is investing in research and development as well as in education and skills through various programs and activities such as the European Research Area or the EU Research and Innovation Programme Horizon Europe. Having said that, in order to assess how the EU is doing in the area of science and technology, as well as understand the pool of skills available within the EU workforce, data is needed. Luckily, that's what Eurostat is doing, and we are actually producing a wide range of official, trustworthy and reliable statistics on science and technology. For this webinar, we will present the European statistics we produce, taking the specific angle of gender equality. In this context, it is important to recall that equality is enshrined in several articles of the European treaties and is thus a founding value of the European Union. Equality is also one of the core priorities of the current von der Leyen Commission, and Eurostat is thus consistently striving to improve the availability of statistical information on equalities and potential grounds for discrimination. When it comes to science, technology, and research, one might wonder, how do women fare compared to men in terms of educational backgrounds in science and technology? What is their share of employment in this area? How are women represented among scientists and engineers in various sectors of the economy? How many women researchers do we have in the EU as compared to men? How has this situation evolved over time? Just a couple of spoilers before I pass on the floor to my colleagues who have all these figures and will walk you through them in the next 30 minutes. We do not have equality yet when it comes to EU scientists and engineers, and the figure has been stabilizing at around 40% during the last decade. We do not have yet equality either in the research and development department throughout the EU. Higher education and government sectors are fairly equal, but the situation is at a low 23% when it comes to the business sector. Okay, since I've said a couple of spoilers, I will stop now and leave the floor to my statisticians colleague, Sorina and Alvaro, who will explain in details all you need to know on our European statistics on women in science, technology and research. After the presentation and before the Q&A session, we will also have the pleasure of welcoming one of our close colleagues, Athanasia, who is Policy Officer in DG R&I, and she will give us some additional insights, this time on the EU policies linked to gender equality in science, technology and research. I wish you a very nice webinar.
Thank you, Sophie, for this very interesting introduction. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker. As Sophie said, it's Alvaro Diaz Soto, Head of Innovation and Digitalization Unit at Eurostat. And Alvaro will give an overview of European statistics on women in science, technology, and research. Over to you, Alvaro.
Thank you, Romina. Good morning, everybody. I'm Alvaro Diaz, Head of Unit responsible for the statistics on science and technology. Thanks for joining us today's webinar. We will be talking in our presentations today about women in science, technology and research, and we will try to illustrate it with figures that you could find in Eurostat's database. As we have limited time, in these presentations, we will try to give you some hints, but also to keep it simple. As Sophie said in her intervention, science, technology, and research are activities that are present in almost every aspect of our daily lives. How can we measure the involvement of women on these three activities and answer to relevant questions about how they are represented? We can look at different data that Eurostat is publishing. More concretely, in this webinar, we will be looking at the people that work or potentially can work in science and technology, the so-called human resources in science and technology. Then we will have a more in-depth look to some economic activities where science, technology, and research are highly represented, the so-called high technology and knowledge-intensive sectors. And last but not least, we will be talking about the personnel that is working in research and development. So let's start first with the human resources in science and technology. But before we jump into the data, we should first start with some definitions and some concepts. And for that, I just want you to remember about three things: a city, Canberra, and two concepts: education and occupation. Why Canberra? Because this is the city that gives the name to the manual that is used to internationally compare the statistics in human resources in science and technology, the so-called Canberra Manual. Why education and occupation? Because these are the two characteristics of people that we are going to look at to say if somebody could be considered as a human resource in science and technology. The Canberra Manual defines, and it does in a way more formal way than I will do in this presentation, that the person is a human resource in science and technology if he or she has a tertiary education and or works in an occupation related to science and technology. So the statistics about human resources in science and technology, and I want you to remember that, look at both the people that could work in science and technology, those having a tertiary education, and those that work in science and technology. In this broad definition of human resources in science and technology, we do have different subgroups for which we also have data in Eurostat website, and that can help us to better understand and answer to different questions. For example, if we were interested in answering to the question, who could work in science and technology, we could have a look to the persons having a tertiary education. If we are interested, though, in answering to the question, who is actually working in science and technology, we could have a look only to the occupation and look at the people working in science and technology. Apart from these two subcategories, we do have what we call the core, which are the people that have tertiary education and work in science and technology. And apart from those groups, we have a very specific subgroup, which are the scientists and engineers, which are those that have very specific occupations related to science and technology. So now that we understand the different concepts, let's start talking about data. In 2021, there were 239 million people between 25 and 64 years old in the EU. This is our reference population. We can see that there is an equal share of men and women in these 239 million people. Out of them, 99 million people that hold a tertiary education degree or work in an occupation that is linked to science and technology. This is our broad concepts of human resources in science and technology. And for these 99 million people, 47% are men and 53% are women. Within these 99 million people, 79 million people are the ones that hold a tertiary education degree, the human resources in science and technology by education. And here we can see that the share of women is 54%. Also, within these 99 million people, we have the 68 million people that are the ones that are working in an occupation related to science and technology. And here the percentage of men and women are a bit more balanced, 52% women, 48% men. 47 million people are considered the core of the human resources in science and technology, as they are the ones that hold a tertiary education degree and work in science and technology. Here, women also have a greater share than men, accounting for 54% of the 47 millions. When we are talking about occupation, people are considered as working in science and technology if they are working in two categories, professionals or technicians and associated professionals. Professionals are subdivided in four submajor groups: physical, mathematical, and engineering science professionals, life science and health professionals, teaching professionals, and other professionals. The first two groups are making up the subset of scientists and engineers. In 2021, this subset of professionals accounted for 16 millions out of the 99 millions working in science and technology. And in terms of share, we see a big difference between men and women, as men accounted for 59% of all the scientists and engineers. Now that we have a clear idea of the different concepts and of the broad population and distribution in 2021, let's compare a bit the evolution over time. In Eurostat's website, you can find data comparing all the different categories, but as we do have limited amount of time for this webinar, we are going to mainly focus on the core, those individuals that hold a tertiary education degree and work in science and technology, and in the category of scientists and engineers. So we can see in the graph the evolution on the number of women and men holding a tertiary education degree and working in science and technology over the last 20 years in the EU. In 2002, the number of men and women working in science and technology was similar, around 12 million each. Over time, the number of women has grown significantly more than the number of men. And in 2021, the number of women working in science and technology and holding a tertiary education degree was around 25.5 millions, while men accounted for around 21.5 millions. As we can see, the number of women employed in science and technology has more than doubled in the last 20 years. The two lines in the next graph represent, out of the number of women or men with tertiary education, the percentage of women or men who is working in science and technology. So those that could work compared to those that they actually work. As we can see, until 2019, the share has been higher for men than for women. The difference was not very high, only 2 percentage points. The share of both men and women went down from 2011 to 2014 and then back up until 2019. We can see that then, when both fell during the pandemic, the share of women fell less than the one for men. And when the share recovered in 2021, we can see that the recovery has been higher for women than for men. If we stop now looking at the core and we start looking at the subgroup of scientists and engineers, we see that men are considerably more represented than women, and that this trend has maintained for the last 10 years. Still, we can see that the number of women scientists and engineers has grown by almost 2 million in 10 years, almost a 42% growth. In parallel, the number of men scientists and engineers has also grown around 2 million people, which means that the gap has barely closed during these 10 years. In share, women scientists and engineers accounted by 39% of the total number of scientists and engineers in 2011, and now in 2021, this share has gone up to 40%. And now, in this final relevant graph, we can look at the unemployment of men and women having a tertiary education in comparison with unemployment of men and women not having a tertiary education. We can see that in the last 20 years, the unemployment of men has remained lower than the one for women, when we are talking both about people holding a tertiary education degree and not holding a tertiary education degree. We can also see that during this whole period, the unemployment for both men and women holding a tertiary education degree has been substantially lower than the one for people not holding a tertiary education degree. Going to university pays off, looks like. We also see that in the last 10 years, between 2011 and 2021, the unemployment rate of women holding a tertiary education degree went down by 0.9%, while in the same period, the unemployment for men holding the same level of education went down only by 0.7%. So, as a summary, in this presentation, we have tried to explain you a bit the concepts behind the measurement of human resources in science and technology, and also give you some insights on the data that you can find in Eurostat database, your website. I want you from this presentation to remember at least 4 facts from the last 10 years. First one, the share of women with tertiary education and employment in science and technology went up 2% from 52% in 2011 to 54% in 2021. Second one, the share of women scientists and engineers went up 1% from 39% in 2011 to 40% in 2021. Third one, the absolute number of women scientists and engineers has grown by 42% in this period, while the absolute number of men scientists and engineers has grown 31%. And the last one, the unemployment rate of women with tertiary education is 0.9% lower in 2021 than 10 years ago. That's all from my side. I hope that you have enjoyed the presentation. My colleague Sorina will continue now giving you insights on the data of women in high-tech sectors and on research and development personnel. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alvaro, for your presentation. And as Alvaro said, we will now go over to another Eurostat colleague, Sorina Veju, who is a team leader for science, technology, and innovation. And Sorina will continue with the second part of the presentation on women in science, technology, and research. The floor is yours, Sorina.
Thank you, Romina, and hello, everyone. I am Sorina Veju. I will go with you through the next chapters of our presentation, namely high technology and knowledge-intensive sectors and R&D personnel. Let me guide you through my presentation. I will talk first about high technology and knowledge-intensive services. Just to explain what this is. These are special aggregates of the economic activity that we use to focus on the sectors that are most relevant for science and technology. And in these special aggregates, the industries are classified based on the expenditure on research and development, while services are classified as more or less in knowledge-intensive services by the level of education of the persons that are employed in these sectors, by how many people have tertiary education. And compared to human resources in science and technology, here we will include all the persons regardless of their education, and we will cover a narrower part of the economy because we look only at some sectors. Just to get an idea of what we mean by high technology and knowledge-intensive services, I show you some examples. For example, in the high technology manufacturing, we have industries like pharmaceutical, computer, and electronics. In the middle categories, we have chemicals, machinery, or plastic products. And then in the lowest range, we have the production of food, textile, or wood and paper. In the services, we have a lot of aggregates, but I'll list here only two. The knowledge-intensive services that mostly require higher education are things like water and air transport, publishing, broadcasting, computer technology, but also education, scientific research, or public administration. These are also divided further into a group that is called high technology knowledge-intensive services, which are the knowledge-intensive services that use a lot of high technologies. And here are a narrower group like video and TV production, broadcasting, telecoms, or scientific research, for example. And I will show you here the comparative view of how women are employed in the wider economy as compared to the high technology sectors. The ranking is done by the share of women in the high technology sectors, and we see that in all countries, the women's employment in the high-tech sectors is lower than their overall employment in the economy. The share of women in all economic activities is around 46% in the EU, but it is around 50% in some countries, like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and it is just above 40% at the other end of the scale in countries like Malta, Romania, and Greece. In exchange, the EU share is around 33% in the high-tech sectors, but there are countries where this is above or almost 40%, like Bulgaria, Estonia, and Lithuania. And there are also countries where the participation of women in high-tech sector is quite low, below 30%, like Czechia, Belgium, Malta, or the Netherlands. Here I will show you the share of male and female in all sectors of economy. That is the line at the top, compared to several of the special aggregates that I mentioned before. We can see the well-known fact that women tend to participate more in services than in manufacturing. But we can also see that, for example, women participate more in the low and in the high technology manufacturing, but much less in the middle technology manufacturing. And finally, we also see that women are overrepresented in the knowledge-intensive services, but their share drops around 30% in the knowledge-intensive services that also use high technology. Here, I will show you also some special examples compared to the special aggregates and to the total level of activity. You can see some sectors where women are very little present. Just some examples, and these are mainly manufacturing of motor vehicles and land or water transport. You see that in some areas their participation is even lower than 20%. Now I will move to the research and development area, which is our third area of interest for today. To explain it quickly, research and development is systematic work to increase our knowledge. And this can concern any area of knowledge, including culture, art, or society. R&D personnel refers to all the persons employed in R&D, and this work includes some supporting work like management or administration. And the researchers are a subset of the R&D personnel based on the level of responsibility in conducting research. Compared to the human resources in science technology, the R&D domain excludes people that are not directly engaged in R&D in their current work, but includes anybody working on R&D regardless of their qualifications. I will show you now the share of R&D personnel and the share of women researchers. We have only the 2019 data because this data comes only every second year, so we don't have yet an early, more fresh breakdown by sex. Here you see that the share of female in the R&D personnel and researchers are quite similar in all countries. They are above a bit above 30% in the EU, and you can also see that there are large differences between countries. There are countries where the share of women R&D personnel is around 50%, but at the other extreme, we have countries where this is even below 30%. In all countries, the two shares, the R&D personnel and researchers, are very close to each other, and in most countries there are more women among R&D personnel than among researchers, but there are a few exceptions where women are more represented among researchers than in R&D personnel, like in Romania, Ireland, Italy, and Slovakia. When we look at the R&D activity, we also look at our data divided into economic sectors. We have four main sectors, which are business enterprise, government sector, higher education, and the private non-profit. For the private non-profit, we will not show the data because in most countries it is insignificant. But here I show you the total compared to the other three sectors. And you can see that there is a very strong variation in the women's participation in these sectors. At EU level, women account for around 35% of the R&D personnel, but in the government and higher education sector, they are close to 50%, while in the business sector, they just represent a bit above 20%. And we also see, if we look into more detail in the charts, is that the countries don't rank in the same way in the various sectors. Like, for example, Netherlands is somewhere in the middle for the education sector, but the representation of women is quite low in the government sector. Here we have a look at the absolute numbers of women researchers and R&D personnel and their share in the total R&D personnel and researchers and how they evolved in time. So the bars are measured on the left side scale and show the absolute numbers, how they change between 2013 and 2019. And you see that the absolute numbers of women increased both for R&D personnel and for researchers. The lines correspond to the scale which is on the right, which shows the percentage, the share of the women in total. And you see that here the evolution has been very slow, that in fact the share has been almost constant since 2011, because at the same time that the number of women has increased, also the number of men in this area has increased. So the share is more or less constant. To sum up some key findings that we have seen together, we can remember that the share of women in in all economic activities is substantially higher than their representation in high technology sectors. Women tend to be overrepresented in knowledge-intensive services, but when these knowledge-intensive services use high technology, suddenly their representation drops. And then we have just seen that the number of female R&D personnel has increased substantially since 2003, but their share in the total R&D personnel and in the total researchers have increased very little in these years. I would also like to show you now where to find our data. If you go to the Eurostat main page and you look into the database, our theme is the last one at the bottom of the list, science, technology, and digital society. And then if you expand the tree further, you will see the three topics that we have discussed today: human resources in science and technology, employment in high-tech industry and knowledge-intensive services, and R&D personnel. And then you can also look from our main page at the statistical themes, and then again, if you look into science, technology, and innovation, you will find a lot of information and publications about our data. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Sorina. And now for our final presentation, we have Athanasia Mungu, who is a Policy Officer in the Directorate General Research and Innovation. And Athanasia will tell you a little bit more about the policy perspective. Over to you, Athanasia.
Thank you very much, Romina, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar by Eurostat. My name is Athanasia Mungu, and I'm a Policy Officer at DG Research and Innovation. And I have prepared a short presentation for you about the policy perspective on gender equality in research and innovation. Well, first of all, the main framework for our policies is the European Research Area, where already gender equality and gender mainstreaming has been one of the main priorities since more than a decade. So we have set three main objectives. First, to have gender equality in careers and also provide equal opportunities to researchers, to have gender balance in decision-making bodies and positions, and third, to integrate the gender dimension into research and innovation content. That is, to make sure that the biological characteristics and also the social features of both men and women are considered as relevant. So our approach has been to foster institutional change. That means to change the system. So over the past decade and through our previous funding programs, we have provided support to organizations to implement their gender equality plans. And now, as policies evolve, we have now a new European Research Area communication that actually gave rise to more ambitious actions and policies. So we will see them now. So currently we have a new funding program that is in full swing, Horizon Europe, where we have strengthened our policies regarding gender equality at three different levels. First of all, we have now a new eligibility criterion. So that means that every public body, research organization, or higher education institution that wants to receive European funding needs to have in place a gender equality plan. And this is applicable for all European member states and countries that are associated to the program. Second, we have also made the integration of the gender dimension into research and innovation content mandatory by default, and also one of the award criteria that is evaluated under excellence. And we also look at gender balance in research teams, which is one of the ranking criteria for proposals that have received the same score. So in order to see actually to what extent we have made progress against our objectives, we need data. And in our DG, at DG Research and Innovation, we have a monitoring publication that is called She Figures. and actually monitors the state of gender equality in research and innovation across European member states and associated countries. So through robust indicators, we explore, for example, how women are being, and men, also how women are being represented in terms of graduates. Also, we look at their career progression. Also, we look at their working conditions, and also at the research and innovation output. So, for example, if we have a look at the latest available data from Eurostat back in 2020, we can see that at doctoral graduate level in the EU, we have almost reached gender parity, with women representing 47% among the total graduates. However, if we have a closer look at the field of education, we can see that there are some disparities. For example, women doctoral graduates tend to be overrepresented in some fields, for example, in education or in the health and welfare, where you can see that the representation is close to 60% or even above, while they are being underrepresented in some fields, such as in information communication technologies and in engineering, manufacturing, and construction. So, for example, here, the representation is less than 30%. With SHE figures, we also have our own database where we can also see women's representation at different levels of academia. So, for example, here you can see that we have 4 different grades. So grade D would be the equivalent of a post that doesn't normally require a PhD, but as we go then higher up in the academic ladder, for example, here you can see grade A positions signify the equivalent of for full professorship positions, and women represent a bit more than 26%. So this is quite low. And if we also have a look at what is the situation in decision-making positions, which is also these posts are very important, as this is where decisions are being made. We can see that among heads of higher education institutions, women represent a bit less than 1/4 of these positions. Now, in terms of inventorship, what we mean with inventorship is patent applications. We can see that less than 11% of the patent applications that are being submitted in the EU are by women. So this is a very, very low number compared to the equivalent number of patent applications being submitted by men. And if you also remember a bit at the beginning of my presentation when I referred to the gender dimension to research and innovation content as one of our priorities, at both EU level and world level, the percentage of a country's publications that have considered such a dimension is less than 2%. So this is extremely low, and we can expect also that obviously this percentage would be highest in some fields, for example, and it is in the medical and health sciences, but still it's at a very, very low level, only at 4%. I would also like to show you some more data on authorship that come also from our DG Research and Innovation. So we can see that the percentage of women authors in scientific publications is at 34% at the European level. And we can see that there has been some increase compared to 20 years ago, where this number was a bit less than 25%. And what is also very interesting to look at is the gender composition of authors in scientific publications. So, for example, now in 2020, more than 60% of the scientific publications come from both men and women from a mixed gender group. But what is also interesting to look at here in this graph is, for example, that while the share of only male teams has decreased over the past 20 years and is now at 30%. The equivalent percentage of publications coming only from female or women teams is still at very, very low levels and still less than 10%. So what's next in terms of policy? Now we have reached a certain momentum in terms of strengthened provisions regarding gender equality in Horizon Europe. So now we're very busy implementing these measures and also monitoring them. At the same time, we also have a European Research Area Policy Agenda that has some actions that will be implemented by the European Commission, member states, and also stakeholders over the next years. We have specifically an action that focuses on promoting gender equality and fostering inclusiveness. And some of these priorities, some of the priority areas within this action is, for example, to tackle gender-based violence in the European Research and Innovation System, and also in cooperation with national research funding organizations to develop principles for the better integration and the evaluation of the gender perspective in research and innovation content. To wrap things up, some key takeaways. We can see that when we look at higher academic and decision-making positions, there are still some persisting gender gaps, but overall, we can see that there are also some positive trends with progress towards gender parity. However, depending on the area, for example, in inventorship, we saw that women are significantly underrepresented, and also in authorship, there is still some room for improvement. Finally, some useful resources. If you're interested in finding out more about what we do and our policies on gender equality in research and innovation, you can visit our webpage. And if you're also interested more in SHE figures, you can also scan this QR code that will lead you right straight to our interactive website, where you can find more material and also some country pieces to see also how your country is performing in terms of gender equality in research and innovation. And that would be all for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Athanasia, and thank you all for these very insightful presentations. We will now go over to the questions and answer session. Let me just remind you about Slido for posting your questions. Here again on screen, you will see the code and the QR you can use for posting your questions. Before we start, I see we have already a large number of questions. We will try to cover as many of your questions as possible during these minutes. However, we also would like to stick to time. So if there is no time to give you all the answers, we will either post the reply in Slido afterwards, or especially if the answer requires some more analysis from our side, we will redirect you to our support hotline. So I won't take any additional time now, and we will start with the question and answer session. We have received a number of questions on the data collection, whether it's based on gender and on sex. So I will give the floor to Alvaro, who will shed some light on this.
Thank you, Romina. So in fact, Eurostat data collects data according to regulations, and these regulations are agreed with member states. The data that we collect in Eurostat relates to sex, normally male and female. And the terms men, women, which relate to gender, are only used for dissemination and communication purposes. But you can see that in our tables in Eurostat websites, the variable name is normally sex. The data that we disseminate is not normally collected by Eurostat, but is collected by member states themselves. It's validated by them, normally aggregated at national level, and then sent to Eurostat to compute the European, the EU figures. Eurostat, then we are in charge of publishing these EU figures with the national data as well. The member states, normally they collect this data coming from different sources, depending on the statistical domain and on the flexibility that is given by the different regulations. And they can use different sources like surveys where the people will say what they are, if they consider male, female, or from administrative data that then will be taken from official records. And then member states and Eurostat, they have strong quality standards, and we implement the European Code of Practice, setting the quality principles when it comes to the production of European statistics. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro. Thank you, Alvaro. So let's move on to question number 2. As you know, working in research demands a lot of hours of your time. I would like to ask what is the plan about maternity and research in the EU? And I think our colleague Athanasia would like to answer that question. However, we cannot see her on screen at the moment. So I suggest we go to the next question and then we go to question number 2 when Athanasia is back. So question number 3, does the data give hints to where the gender gap starts? Is it a lack of encouragement for girls when young, choice of education, or discrimination later? And I think this question is for Alvaro again.
Okay, thank you, Romina. Well, I think the data won't tell us if there is a lack of encouragement, but it can tell us about the education and employment of women in science and technology over the years. And what we can see from the data is that when we talk about tertiary education, women are getting more tertiary education degrees than men in the EU. We can also see that women are majority if we look at the broad definition of human resources on science and technology. And they are normally a majority in the different subgroups, except for the subgroup of scientists and engineers. Maybe we can remember from the presentation that the scientists and engineers, they correspond to those that have an occupation of physical, mathematical, and engineering science professionals, and of life science and health professionals. I think that, you know, in order to answer a bit more in detail about this choice of education discrimination later, and if we look especially where women are underrepresented, that is in the field of scientists and engineers, we would need to have a look to the fields of education and study in detail to see if there could be any correlation between the STEM degrees, where in some cases women are still a minority, and the occupations that I have mentioned before. I think that this is all what I can say from the data. I see now back, I hope that I see now back at Athanasia. Maybe I would invite her to contribute in case that you can say something from the analysis that you have made from the policy side.
Thanks a lot, Alvaro. Indeed, I mean, we can see that the gender gap tends to widen as we go higher up in the academic positions. And what we also try to do with our policies is, with the gender equality plans, to tackle the structural barriers that are actually at the universities, and to make also women and men, and actually all researchers, progress in their careers. So yes, indeed, there are some disparities that we see, but we're also trying to tackle these with our policies.
Thank you, Athanasia. And we can now move back to question number 2, which we would like you to answer. As you know, working in research demands a lot of hours of your time. I would like to ask, what is the plan about maternity and research in the EU? Thank you, Athanasia.
Thank you, Romina. Indeed, that's a very good question and a very tricky, difficult question at the same time, because yes, it takes a lot of time when you are a parent and you work in research. Now, as we have Horizon Europe, I mean, it started a couple of years ago, so it's a bit difficult now to introduce some specific schemes regarding maternity leave. However, we have some ongoing discussions to better reflect this in the future. At the same time, though, I mean, with gender equality plans, I would also like to highlight that it is also up to the organizations to implement and to have in place some policies about maternity leave. For example, one of the recommended areas that we suggest to be covered by gender equality plans is specifically work-life balance. So that would also help researchers who are also parents to better allocate, yes, to have more help in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Athanasia. Moving on to the next question. how girls and boys' interest in maths and sciences grow over time, and how this trend correlate with the proportion of girls and boys majoring in STEAM. Can you look into the number of girls and boys which enter STEAM specialties in university and the proportion of girls and boys which graduate? And I think this question is for our colleague Sorina.
Thank you, Romina. We don't have the data on what children are interested in and pupils, but we have data on how their education progresses, and then we can look how this the fields of education change over time. However, the data is collected by field of education only starting with the secondary education. So there you can see in secondary education how many pupils are enrolled by sex, and then you can also see in our data how many students enroll in different types of programs and how many graduate. So you can follow this evolution and see how the breakdown changes over time.
Thank you, Sorina. Now moving on to question number 5, which I think it's in Alvaro's wheelhouse. So, do you have data on the number of women STEAM working in public administration in each member state?
Well, this is a tricky one, and I think that there are several challenges in this question. When we are talking about the STEM, we are talking about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and we are talking about the fields of studies. And this is something that it is really collected in education statistics, which means that you can go to our website, you can check in education statistics, and you can find a wealthy amount of data about the STEM and the disaggregation by sex, about the STEM students and STEM graduates. Still, when we are talking about our data on human resources science and technology and researchers on researchers personnel, we are talking mainly about the employment, and when we talk about the education, we are talking about the education level. So the data that we collect when we talk about human resources science and technology is based on the education level, and mostly based on the tertiary education. But we don't collect the data on the fields of study. Okay, so it's difficult to make the connection there. In the case of occupation, when we are trying to remember that in science and human resources science and technology, we were talking about education and occupation. So when we talk about occupation, we are talking about the kind of tasks that are done based on the international classification called ISCO. And we are mainly talking about the professionals and technicians and associated professionals. So it's quite difficult to link both these two dimensions that we collect in the human resources on science and technology, this tertiary education level, and this occupation is difficult to link with the field of study that are collected in education statistics, okay? Second challenge in this question is about this public administration. Because when we collect data for human resources science and technology, we collect data according to the classification of economic activities, which is the NACE. And there is a division that is about public administration of defense. But this classification does not make any distinction regarding the institutional sector. It's not the same as in national accounts where we have the government sector. Or in our case, in research and development, where we do have as well the sector of performance and we have the government sector. But when we are talking about human resources science and technology, we don't have it a clear distinction. We cannot clearly identify what is government, because in NACE, you are classified according to what you do, not according if you are a government or a private company. Okay, so in this division of public administration and defense, you can find private corporations, and in other divisions of the NACE, you can also find governmental bodies that are doing other activities that are not public administration. So that is the second challenge of this question. We can, though, if we look at the data coming from R&D, the data that Sorina was explaining in her presentation, we can find some data about the government sector and the data on the researchers. These researchers are not linked to their education, so they are not directly linked to the STEM categories of education, but they are linked to the occupations. Still, maybe this can be used by the user in order to illustrate as a proxy. So I think that that is all I can say about this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvaro. Moving on to question number 6. Do you have any tips for young women starting in science, technology, or research? Athanasia, would you like to take this one?
Thanks, Romina. Yes, I can take this one. This is also a tricky question because it depends on whether you would like, what you would like to do. If you're interested in pursuing a career in research and in science and technology, we're also trying with our policy.
I think we lost again the connection with Athanasia, so let's continue while waiting for her. Question number 7. These men and women are more or less equally represented in S&T, I mean science and technology. Is it incorrect to attribute the gender pay gap to women choosing the wrong work sectors? And I think this question is for Sorina.
Well, when the gender pay gap data is published actually with breakdowns, so we can see that it persists even in the same type of activities. So it's not explained purely by the choice of the wrong sectors. It's a more sophisticated analysis that we cannot answer immediately with our data, because you would have to look more into education, but also other factors around this choice and environment conditions. So it's a very complex analysis that cannot be answered quickly.
Okay, thank you. Athanasia, would you like to continue? I see you're back.
Thanks a lot, Romina, and sorry, apologies for this. So yes, as I was saying, I mean, we're trying to have the right framework for all researchers to progress in their careers. So for example, I mean, we saw that there is an underrepresentation of women in STEM, and also this is something that needs to be tackled from different perspectives and also from different sectors. For example, you have the education sector, the higher education institution sector, and also the private sector. So what we also did recently, we're also trying to bring together all these actors to try and tackle this issue collectively. So, for example, we will post also a link about one of our recent publications on how to better tackle the underrepresentation of women in STEM careers. So this is what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Athanasia. I will now read out 2 questions which I think can be answered by Alvaro. So one is, in your presentation, you talked about the differences at EU level across time and for the different categories. What about the differences per country? And the other question is, you talk about the differences between men and women in science and technology. What about pay differences or differences in age? Thank you.
Okay, so I will try. So 3 things: country level, age, and gender pay gap. Okay, so if we start with the country, we do have, of course, the data for the different countries, for all the different subgroups in the human resources and science and technology. From the top of my head, I could say some facts that came across when we were preparing this webinar. For example, we know that the scientists and engineers is the category where women are more underrepresented, but we could see that between 2011 and 2021, the share of women scientists and engineers as percentage of the labor force grew in all member states, but in one. I can maybe also mention that there are 5 countries, and I think that we're talking about Lithuania, Bulgaria, Portugal, Denmark, and Spain, where the share of women is higher than the share of men for all the 5 categories of human resources science and technology. This is also including scientists and engineers. Then, of course, if we leave aside this category where women are underrepresented of science and technologies, I think that these 20 member states, that they have a higher share than women than men in the other 4 categories. And then another fact is that if we look only at education, there is only one member state that had more men with tertiary education than women. In the other 26, women has a higher percentage of share on tertiary education degrees. Then you mentioned in the second question about the age differences. And we do have some data on researchers in research and development broken down by age group. But this is not a mandatory breakdown. So there you can go and you can check some data, but we don't have for all the countries, and we don't have at the EU aggregate level. But we do have at the age group breakdown for human resources, science and technology. And if I remember correctly, at EU level, the share of women is higher than the share of men for the different breakdowns that we have available. And we have breakdowns between 25 and 34 years old, between 35 and 44 years old, and from 45 to 64 years old. And the share of women is higher than the share of men in all of these breakdowns for all the HRST subcategories, but for scientists and engineers. Okay, so it mirrors a bit what we saw about the countries. We can also see that in all these categories, and here we can include the scientists and engineers, the highest share is for women between 25 and 34 years, and it gets lower as we get older. So the category of women between 45 and 64 years old, the share of women is lower than the one of 35 to 44, and this one is lower than the one from 25 to 34. Then you were mentioning about the pay difference, and as I think that Sorina mentioned in her answer before, in the data of human resources science and technology, we do not have pay breakdowns in the different data sets that we have used for our analysis today, but Eurostat does publish this data on gender pay gap broken down by economic activity sector. And there, if you go and look at that data, you can that can help you performing an analysis on the gender disparities. This data, you can find it in the labor market and in the earnings folder in our database. And I think that that's all I can say for these questions.
Thank you, Alvaro. I'm looking at the time, and unfortunately, we need to wrap up. I know there are more questions waiting for an answer, but as I said, we will either put the reply in Slido, or my colleagues in this moment, they are posting our user support email address. So you can direct your questions to our user support service. It's a multilingual service, and you will get an answer from one of our experts soon. Just a couple of things before you go. As I said at the beginning, we will post in Slido a brief satisfaction survey. Please stay for one moment and fill in it. It's important for us to know how much you like this webinar and give us some feedback. And then we are not stopping here. There are other webinars coming up. We plan to have a webinar on transport statistics and one on SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, later in May. So stay tuned, and I hope to see you there. We will put the recording of this webinar up on Eurostat's website and Facebook page. So don't worry if you missed parts of that. You can always watch it again. Otherwise, I would like to end by saying a big thanks to all our presenters today for your time, and thank you all for having listened to this webinar. I hope you found it interesting, useful, and as I said, we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Have a nice day.